So what if the neon, the booming boom boxes, and just that unapologetic confidence of the 1980s wasn't swagger at all? What if it was actually armor?
Oh, that is such a compelling way to frame it.
Right, because I want you to picture that decade right now. It is incredibly easy to do, you know? Your
Yeah.
brain just immediately floods with those sensory details. You are seeing the glowing, buzzing neon lights cutting through the night.
Hmm.
You are feeling the sharp, imposing angles of those massive power suit shoulder pads. You can practically smell the, slightly dusty scent of that wildly patterned geometric carpet in the local arcade.
Oh, I know exactly that smell.
Yeah. And the sound, right, it's the booming synthesized bass just vibrating out of a massive boombox on a city sidewalk. I mean, the decade is loud, it is flashy, it is just overflowing with the sheer, unrelenting main character energy.
It really is. It's an overwhelming aesthetic.
But the fascinating lens we are applying today, based on our source material, it flips all of that on its head. What if all of that flashy, loud confidence was actually just a highly coordinated defense mechanism? Yeah, and that is exactly the question that unlocks this entire era. When we look back at the 1980s, we're almost always blinded by the spectacle of it, you know? We see the highlight reel,
Right.
but a highlight reel only exists because someone made a very deliberate choice to edit out all the missed shots, the fumbles, the exhaustion, and that profound anxiety of sitting on the bench. We are looking at a carefully curated image, a society-wide performance.
And that is our mission for this deep dive today. We're getting into this incredible source document, Mac 1980's, and we are unpacking the psychological architecture of the 1980s. So we're not just reading a timeline here.
No, not at all.
We're using an analytical framework that views the era's humor, its fashion, the economic policies, and the politics as this massive, complex performance. We are looking at the deep vulnerability hiding right behind the volume.
Exactly. And to do that, to truly understand the performance in the 1980s, we actually can't start in 1980.
Right, you got to look at the pregame. Yes, the pregame soundtrack. We have to track the evolution of the American identity from the raw, unfiltered survivalism of the 1970s directly into the highly produced, intensely brand-driven consumerism of the 80s.
And I think for you listening, I want you to consider how much of your current daily identity, curating your social media profiles or treating your personal tastes as an actual brand, was essentially invented 40 years ago.
It's wild to think about because history isn't neatly cordoned off by decades, right? You cannot understand the loud, performative confidence of the 80s without deeply understanding the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of the
The
1970s.
70s were rough.
They're really weird. The 1970s was a messy, complicated, raw period. Like if the 1960s was an era defined by these massive, sweeping utopian dreams.
The whole, peace and love, changing the world vibe.
Exactly. The idea that society could be fundamentally remade from the ground up. The 1970s was the harsh, cynical awakening from that. It was life coming out of the 60s and realizing that the utopian check bounced.
Yeah, but I have to push back a little on the idea that the 70s was just this era of pure, sad disillusionment. Because, I mean, when you look at the culture that actually came out of it, it doesn't feel defeated.
Yeah, right.
It feels incredibly alive, just in a much grittier way. So was it really just exhaustion, or was it a pivot to a different kind of survival?
That's a really great distinction. It was absolutely a pivot to survival, but that survival was born from a very specific kind of systemic exhaustion. Think about the psychological weight of that era.
Right.
You have the lingering aftermath of the Vietnam War, which left a massive emotional and moral debt on the national psyche. You have Watergate, which didn't just cause a political scandal, it fundamentally shattered the baseline illusion of the infallible American leader.
The trust was just gone.
Completely. The social contract felt broken.
Right.
But compounding that emotional exhaustion was a brutal daily economic struggle. The sources really emphasize this. The 1970s was defined by staggering inflation and the oil shocks.
Okay, let's unpack those mechanisms, because we hear the word inflation all the time today, but the reality of the 70s was entirely different. We aren't just talking about groceries being a little more expensive, right?
Not at all. It was systemic.
We are talking about a daily, visceral reminder that the systems governing your life are failing. You know, you are sitting in your car in a gas line for 3 hours on an odd or even day, based on your license plate.
Just hoping the station doesn't run out before you get to the pump.
Exactly. Just so you can go to a job where your paycheck has less purchasing power every single week. That fundamentally rewires how you view your own stability, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It strips away the illusion of control.
Mm-hmm.
When the macroeconomic environment is that hostile, life goes from an idealistic pursuit of passion to a gritty defensive reality. The highlight reel is gone. You are just trying to figure out the play in real time.
Yeah.
But to your earlier point, out of that neglect, out of that loss of control, something incredibly generative happens.
Mm-hmm.
The survival instinct physically manifests in the environment. Look at the cities in the 1970s.
Oh, New York especially.
Yes, they were largely neglected by the federal government. You have the infamous Ford to City drop-dead headline regarding New York's bankruptcy. The infrastructure was crumbling.
It was falling apart.
But in that exact crucible of neglect, communities started building new cultural architectures out of absolute necessity.
Right, like the graffiti-covered trains. I love that. They weren't just vandalism, they were low-key art galleries on wheels. If the city won't clean the trains or invest in the neighborhoods, the youth are going to use those steel canvases to broadcast their existence to the entire 5 boroughs.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And the block parties, I mean, we think of early hip-hop, and the mechanism of it is literally pulling power from the municipal grid. You have DJs running extension cords into the bases of street lamps to power their turntables.
Yes, the literal siphoning of the city's electricity.
Siphoning the electricity to power a cultural revolution. It's amazing.
And that is why the music of the 1970s broadly reflects this complex, defiant, emotional landscape. Disco, for instance, wasn't just mindless club music. The sources show it emerged from marginalized communities, Black, Latino, and LGBTQ underground clubs, as a genre that essentially engineered joy out of sorrow.
I mean, what a vibe.
It was a rhythmic declaration that said, the economy is collapsing, the city is broke, but we are going to dictate the terms of our own survival on this dance floor. It was highly defiant escapism.
And then you have funk and soul running parallel to that. Deep grooves, real unfiltered feelings. Everyone, through this music and this emerging culture, is essentially asking the exact same question. Who am I when the American dream doesn't look anything like the brochure?
Precisely.
You know, it's like the 70s is that awkward half-jock, half-nerd phase of adolescence where you don't fit into a clean identity. So you start cracking jokes and creating art just to survive being unseen.
That's a great analogy.
Let's unpack this a bit more. If the 70s was the quiet kid sketching fire in the back of the classroom, the 80s is when that kid finally stands up and demands the microphone.
Exactly. The 70s feels like this pressurized underground forge. It created a deep, visceral hunger for expression. It bred a desperate need to stand out, to be seen, after a decade of feeling entirely invisible to the people in power.
Yeah, completely ignored.
Which is why the cultural explosion of the 1980s is not random. It is the inevitable release of that pressure valve. The culture had spent a decade creating art in the margins just to survive.
Right.
So by the time the calendar turns to the 1980s, that culture is primed. They're ready to grab the microphone, turn on the neon lights, and broadcast that forged identity to the world. But to do that, they needed a stage.
Right, a bigger platform.
And that stage was built by a massive aggressive shift in the macroeconomic and political power structure of the country.
Okay, yes, because if the 70s was about surviving the cracks in the system, the 80s was about covering those cracks with high-gloss paint and slapping a massive exclusionary price tag on it. We are moving from the cultural grid of the streets directly into the boardrooms and the political demand for power.
Yes.
So let's look at this facade of success. How did we get there economically?
Well, to understand this facade, we have to look at the severe medicine applied to the American economy at the turn of the decade. America entered the 1980s battered. In 1979, Paul Volcker took over the Federal Reserve, and he initiated a brutal, intentional anti-inflation campaign.
And this is crucial, right?
Very. He didn't just tweak the economy, he shocked it. He cranked up interest rates to punishingly high levels to essentially freeze the supply of money.
Okay, let's break down the actual ground-level impact of that, because raising interest rates sounds like dry economic policy, but the human cost is staggering.
It really is.
If you are a small business owner relying on loans to make payroll, or a family trying to buy a house, or a manufacturing plant needing to upgrade equipment, suddenly the cost of borrowing money doubles or triples overnight. You can't afford to operate, you shut down.
Exactly.
So Volcker's policy successfully broke the back of the massive inflation rate, but the side effect was intentionally triggering the severe 1981 to 1982 recession. Unemployment skyrocketed, particularly in the industrial heartland. It was an incredibly painful, suffocating period for the working class.
It was a systemic shock.
Yeah.
And right as the country is reeling from this economic illness, Ronald Reagan takes office in 1981. And the historical consensus highlights that he doesn't just offer policy changes. He offers a highly produced national psychological reset.
Yeah, morning in America.
Right. He looked at a country exhausted by inflation, Vietnam, and energy crises, and he promised a return of national swagger. The narrative shifted. He framed the government not as the imperfect safety net it had been viewed as since the New Deal, but as the fundamental obstacle to human potential.
Right, the whole government is the problem mentality.
Exactly. The free market, the private sector, the individual pursuit of wealth, that was the new savior, according to this new framework.
It's pure branding. But I want to pause here and look at the global context, because this domestic swagger was actually compensating for a massive amount of geopolitical panic.
Yes, that split-screen reality.
The U.S. is projecting this image of unshakable cowboy confidence, but internally the anxiety is through the roof.
Absolutely. The geopolitical reality was incredibly tense. The Cold War was reaching a fever pitch. The nuclear rhetoric was escalating in the early 80s, creating an omnipresent existential dread.
The doomsday clock is just ticking loudly in the background.
Constantly. But economically, the map was completely shifting too. Japan was rising at an unprecedented rate. Their trade surpluses, their dominance in consumer electronics, their automotive efficiency, it created real, palpable anxiety in America that the future was no longer going to be dictated by Detroit or New York, but by Tokyo.
Yeah, the fear of being replaced.
There was a deep fear of being eclipsed. Meanwhile, China, under Deng Xiaoping, was fundamentally restructuring its economy, laying the groundwork for the globalized manufacturing web we see today.
So the United States in the 80s is basically experiencing a victory lap and a panic attack at the exact same time. Flexing in public, stressing in private.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it.
I mean, the culture is loudly proclaiming that America is back and better than ever, but everyone is secretly terrified of nuclear annihilation and losing their economic dominance.
And that macro-level geopolitical anxiety perfectly mirrors the micro-level reality for everyday citizens. The economic restructuring of the 1980s created a deeply fractured split-screen reality domestically.
Right.
On one side of the screen, you had the undeniable boom. You had Wall Street exploding. You had deregulation leading to massive corporate mergers. The rise of the finance sector as the ultimate cultural prestige. The stock market had incredible aggressive energy. Wealth was suddenly not something to be quietly accumulated. It was something to be aggressively displayed.
But on the other side of that split screen, the reality is incredibly bleak. You have plant closures. You have the rapid deindustrialization of the American heartland. You have shrinking local stability for the working class.
Yeah, it's a total hollowing out.
And here is where I really want to dig into the mechanics of this anxiety, because we have to talk about leveraged buyouts and corporate raiders. This wasn't just, the economy changing. This was an active dismantling of the social contract.
That is a vital mechanism to explain. A leveraged buyout is essentially when a smaller entity or a group of investors buys a massive company using almost entirely borrowed money.
Which sounds insane.
It is highly risky. Once they acquire the company, they transfer that massive debt onto the company's own balance sheet. To pay off that sudden crushing debt, they have to ruthlessly cut costs. They fire thousands of workers, they strip the assets, they raid the pension funds, and they sell the company off for parts.
Imagine someone buying your house with a loan and then immediately selling your roof, your furnace, and your plumbing to pay off their own loan, while you are still expected to live inside and pay rent.
That is a terrifying but very accurate analogy.
That was the reality for the American worker in the 80s. The psychological impact of that is devastating. The promise of the mid-20th century was company loyalty. You give us 30 years of hard work, we give you a pension and a gold watch. The 1980s corporate raider era completely vaporized that.
Your loyalty meant nothing.
Nothing. You could be liquidated tomorrow so a shareholder could get a quarterly dividend.
And this creates a profound structural tension. The era demanded success. The culture was screaming greed is good. Wealth was the ultimate visible proof of moral virtue. But the definition of success fundamentally shifted.
Right.
It went from I am stable, I am building a life, I have a reliable job, to I am building an image. Success was no longer about financial security. It was about status. It was about how much money you visibly displayed.
So what does this all mean? The decade tells you, go be great, but it doesn't tell you what to do if the game isn't fair. It sounds like a fast break where only the star players get the ball and everyone else is just left open in the corner waiting for a pass since 1983.
That's the tragic irony of the decade. The 80s sold the image of a luxury lifestyle. The sources point out how wealthy households were leaning into health trends and imported goods.
Dining at high-end restaurants.
Exactly, as a way to signal their victory in this new market. But what do you do if you are on the losing side of that split screen? You still have to perform.
Right, you still have to look like you're winning.
Yes. You see, working-class families relying heavily on TV dinners and hyper-processed convenience foods. And it wasn't just because of the novelty of a microwave. It was because the cost of living was rising, wages were stagnating, and dual-income households became mandatory just to tread water.
Both parents are just exhausted.
Both had to work exhausting hours, leaving absolutely no time to cook. They were exhausted, yet the cultural mandate was that they had to smile and project the image of the awkwardly mobile American dream.
Which brings us to the core mechanism of the decade.
Yeah.
If the economy demands that you display visible success, but the economy has also stripped away your actual financial security, how do you project that success?
Yes. What is the vocabulary?
Right, what is the vocabulary of this new performative identity? And the answer, as the 1980s discovered and codified, was consumerism. We moved from the macroeconomic policies of Wall Street straight into the closets and living rooms of the average person. This is the era of the absolute commodification of identity.
The era of you are what you buy.
You are what you buy. But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Are we really pretending that the 1980s invented consumerism? What about the 1950s?
Good point.
The entire post-war boom was about buying the right vacuum cleaner, getting the perfect lawnmower, keeping up with the Joneses. How is the 80s actually mechanically different from the 50s consumer boom?
It is a critical distinction. The consumerism of the 1950s was fundamentally about assimilation. It was about buying the things that proved you fit into the homogenized suburban ideal. You bought the same lawnmower as your neighbor to prove you belong to the community.
Okay.
The consumerism of the 1980s was the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It was about individuation and self-branding. You weren't buying things to blend in. You were buying things to stand out, to signal your specific personal brand, your edge, your status above the crowd.
Ah, okay. So the 50s was about conformity. The 80s was about hyper-individualized branding. Brands literally became personality traits.
Yes, exactly.
If you wore Nike, you weren't just buying a shoe. You were signaling to the world that you were athletic, driven, and rebellious. If you drove a BMW, you were communicating ruthless upward mobility. If you walked down the street with a Sony Walkman clipped to your belt, you were broadcasting, I am modern, I am in tune, I am living in the future.
It is a radical shift in human history. Prior to this era, for the vast majority of people, identity was inherited. Your identity was your family name, your local community, your religious tradition, your regional geography. You didn't choose it. You were born into it.
Yeah, it was just given to you.
But in the 1980s, identity became fully modular. It became something you constructed from scratch, through style, through taste, through the deliberate choices you made as a consumer.
Like putting together an outfit.
It offered an intoxicating new kind of freedom, the ability to invent yourself completely, but it also introduced immense, relentless, daily pressure. Because if you are what you buy, what happens when you can't afford the right brands?
You become socially invisible. You literally lack the vocabulary to exist in the culture. And the engine driving this pressure, the mechanism teaching everyone how to speak this new language, was the media.
The ultimate dream factory.
Yes. The media in the 1980s acted as a massive dream factory. And the ultimate factory floor opened in 1981, MTV. We really cannot overstate how MTV rewired the human brain. It didn't just change how we listened to music. It fundamentally changed how we perceived human beings.
Exactly. Before MTV, a musician was primarily a voice on the radio or a tiny figure on a distant concert stage. After MTV, musicians became highly curated, larger-than-life visual brands. Madonna, Michael Jackson, Duran Duran, Prince. Their visual aesthetic was entirely inseparable from their sound.
And this visual branding logic bled into absolutely everything. Think about television commercials. In the 70s, a commercial told you what a product did. This soap cleans your dishes.
Very literal.
Very literal. But in the 80s, commercials stopped describing products and started selling entire lifestyles. Drink this soda and you'll be young, beautiful, and surrounded by friends on a beach.
People were no longer just observing reality. They were marinating in exaggerated, perfectly lit, idealized versions of life, which created immense aspirational pressure.
And here is where it gets really interesting. And I want you, the listener, to think about how this connects to your life today. Going to the mall in the 1980s was essentially the analog version of setting up your social media profile page.
Oh, that analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of 80s socialization.
Right. You didn't just go to the mall because you needed a new pair of socks. You went to the mall to construct your avatar. You walk into the neon glow, you pick out your acid-washed jeans, you put on your blazer with those massive shoulder pads.
The physical armor.
Yes, basically armor for your confidence, projecting a wider, more imposing silhouette to hide whatever insecurities you had. You layer on this consumer identity, and then you step out into the food court to prove to the world that you belong. You are performing your identity in real time, hoping you get the analog equivalent of likes from your peers.
And while we are discussing who is allowed to perform which identities, we must examine the profoundly complex racial dynamics of this commodification.
We absolutely do.
The sources outline how the 1980s saw Black cultural innovation become absolutely undeniable and globally influential. The culture bubbling up from the Bronx in the 70s became a global phenomenon.
Hip-hop taking over the world.
Black culture was driving the avant-garde in hip-hop, in fashion, in sports, in language. And mainstream corporate institutions eagerly commodified this because it was undeniably cool, highly energetic, and immensely profitable.
But the paradox, and it's a painful one, is that while the culture was being hyper-commodified, the structural inequality remained deeply entrenched.
Yes.
Urban disinvestment was still rampant. The escalation of the war on drugs disproportionately targeted those exact same communities. Mainstream media often perpetuated brutal, flattening representational stereotypes. So you have this massive contradiction. The culture eagerly consumed Black cool, but it routinely marginalized Black humanity.
It is the ultimate performative dynamic. It is the mechanism of selective visibility. Certain stylistic aspects of a marginalized culture become hyper-visible because they can be packaged, branded, and sold by corporations.
Right.
Meanwhile, the actual political struggles, the systemic poverty, and the complex humanity of the people creating that culture are rendered invisible. You are seen and celebrated only for the aesthetic value you can provide to the open market.
Which is an exhausting way to exist in a society.
Very.
And because identity was now a product you had to constantly maintain, defend, and update, this pressure to perform hit absolutely everyone. But it hit different demographics in very specific ways. Let's look at the emotional tone of the decade across generations.
Different games, same soundtrack.
Exactly. Because they were all playing different games, but they were forced to listen to the exact same high-stress soundtrack. Let's start with the kids, the 5 to 12-year-olds.
For children in the 1980s, the very concept of childhood was unprecedentedly reshaped by deregulation and marketing.
How so?
Well, prior to the Reagan administration, the FCC had strict regulations limiting how many minutes of commercials could be shown during children's programming, and importantly, preventing shows from being based entirely on toys.
Oh, wow. Didn't realize that.
Those regulations were swept away. The result was the era of Saturday morning cartoons acting as highly effective 30-minute product pipelines.
Shows like Transformers, G.I. Joe, or He-Man, they weren't stories that happen to have toys. They were toy catalogs with narratives attached. I love the metaphor we discussed earlier. It's like a child's personality getting DLC packs, downloadable content directly from corporate marketing departments.
It's exactly like that.
You watch the show, you beg your parents to buy the plastic action figure, and by owning that figure, you belong to the social group at recess. They're being trained from age 5 that consumerism equals identity and belonging.
But simultaneously, these same children are absorbing the low-level hum of existential anxiety from the adult world. They might not understand the geopolitical nuances of the Soviet Union, but they know what a nuclear mushroom cloud is.
They're doing drills under their desks.
Exactly. They watch the news. They feel the tension of the Cold War.
Okay.
So their psychological baseline is this bizarre, unprecedented mix of hyper-colored plastic consumer joy layered directly over subconscious nuclear dread.
What a combination. And as those children age into teenagers, the pressure cooker just gets hotter. For the 13 to 19 demographic, identity was entirely performative.
The mall was the social hub.
Yeah, and your music taste wasn't a private preference, it was a tribal affiliation. Are you metal? Are you new wave? Are you hip-hop? And the market demanded that you pick a single lane so they knew exactly how to market to you.
And this demand for categorization created intense friction for anyone who didn't fit neatly into a demographic box.
Yes, the blurred tension, the black nerd. Is this where that tension really started to calcify?
Okay.
If you are a multifaceted human being, say you are a young black teenager who loves synthesizers, comic books, and science fiction, but you also love the emerging hip hop scene and sports, the mainstream, highly branded culture of the 80s didn't know what to do with you.
Right, because it defied the marketing categories.
Society was essentially forcing kids to subclass themselves. I'm multifaceted, but this high school hallway operates like a corporate marketing demographic chart. Why are you making me choose?
The cognitive dissonance of complex identity in a single-lane market is staggering.
It is. When culture becomes a brand, ambiguity becomes a massive liability. You have these kids using arcade high scores as literal social currency, trying to navigate these rigid boxes. But as intense as it was for the teenagers, we really must look at the adults, the 20 to 50-year-olds, who were bearing the economic weight of this entire performance.
They had to pay for it all.
Exactly. For the adults, self-worth became inextricably, almost exclusively, tied to output and visible financial victory. Your job title, your zip code, the specific make of the car in your driveway, that was your human scorecard.
It's comparison culture, but without the internet. You couldn't just silently scroll and feel bad about someone's Instagram vacation. You had to read their physical cues in the office or at the neighborhood barbecue.
The pressure was constant. And while they are trying to project this image of Wall Street success, the economic ground beneath them is constantly shifting. They are the ones facing the leveraged buyouts. They are the ones secretly drowning in the newly expanded world of consumer credit cards just to buy the clothes their teenager needs to survive them all.
Keeping up appearances.
The culture is loudly proclaiming, if you're not winning, what are you doing? But the reality was millions of adults were working longer hours, taking on massive debt just to tread water while smiling.
And then you have the elders, the 50-plus demographic. Their experience, according to the texts, is one of profound cultural whiplash. They grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. They remember a time before identity was something you bought at a mall.
Right.
They were watching the world fragment. They were watching the transition from a society that valued shared sacrifice to a society that seemingly only values individual acquisition. They were looking at the neon circus and asking, is this actually progress? We have lost our shared, simple culture.
And what really finalized that loss of a shared culture, what truly isolated everyone into their own anxieties, was the technology. The 1980s was the first time people truly started controlling and isolating their media diets. Let's talk about the VCR and the Walkman. These aren't just gadgets, they are psychological mechanisms of isolation.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanism of the Walkman. Before the Walkman, music was largely a shared environmental experience. It played on a stereo in a room or from a boombox on a street, and everyone heard it.
You couldn't escape it.
But the Walkman allowed you, for the first time in human history, to overlay your own private cinematic soundtrack onto the public world. You could put on headphones in a crowded, dirty subway car and mentally transport yourself away from the people around you. It gave you immense power over your environment, but it physically and psychologically isolated you from your community.
And the VCR did the exact same thing to the family living room. You no longer had to watch the 3 network channels that everyone else in the country was watching. You could rent a movie and curate your own reality.
The birth of on-demand media.
Which, by the way, created the absolute sacred, high-stakes weekly ritual of going to the video rental store on a Friday night, hoping the exact VHS tape you wanted was in stock, and praying the previous renter had the common decency to actually rewind it.
Oh, the be kind, rewind rule.
We were building these highly customized, individualized bubbles.
But building those individual bubbles fundamentally isolates us from one another. And this brings us to a necessary and critical pivot in our deep dive. We've been discussing the neon, the performance, the curation of identity, and the economic facades. But you cannot have a highlight reel this bright without casting incredibly dark, long shadows.
No, you can't.
We must address what this society-wide performance was specifically designed to hide. Behind the spandex aerobics classes, the power ballads, and the Wall Street bravado, the 1980s was a decade wrestling with profound, devastating tragedy.
It's the static before the signal coming back to completely overwhelm the broadcast. The 80s was defined by stark, horrifying low points that the mainstream, aspirational culture desperately tried to ignore or suppress. Let's talk about the mechanism of the AIDS crisis.
Yes.
You have a massive, terrifying loss of human life happening in real time, decimating entire communities, and the response from the federal government and the broader mainstream culture. For years, it was characterized by devastating stigma, deliberate political neglect, and a horribly slow public health response.
The documents show that the AIDS crisis is the starkest, most tragic example of the era's dark side. It revealed the absolute cruelty of a performative society. The polished, optimistic narrative of 1980s America was highly conditional.
Conditional is the perfect word for it.
If your suffering did not fit the mainstream, aspirational, marketable brand of the nation, you were actively swept under the rug. It required immense, desperate activism, profound human courage from groups like ACTUP, and undeniable scientific urgency to finally force the dominant culture to even acknowledge a human tragedy that was happening right in front of them.
And that conditionality, that harsh line between who matters and who doesn't, extended to the economy, too. We talked about the split-screen economy earlier, but we really need to emphasize the permanent structural damage done here. Wealth concentrated at the top at a staggering, historically unprecedented rate.
The rise of immense economic inequality.
The narrative of trickle-down economics promised that if we enrich the job creators, the wealth will eventually flow down to everyone. But the mechanism of that failed. The wealth stayed at the top, used for stock buybacks and luxury consumption, while entire working-class communities, both urban and rural, were permanently hollowed out as the manufacturing base eroded. The systems were entirely unequal.
Furthermore, overlying all of this domestic inequality and health tragedy was the relentless, omnipresent dread of the Cold War.
Right. Back to the nuclear anxiety.
The rhetoric from Washington in the early 80s was extraordinarily aggressive, framing the geopolitical conflict in literal apocalyptic terms, the evil empire. People were genuinely deeply living with the thought a miscommunication could end human civilization by next Tuesday. That is an unbearable psychological burden for an entire society to carry.
It's mind-boggling, and it leads to these massive, dizzying socio-political contradictions. The text points this out neutrally, but it's fascinating. You have this huge rise in conservative Christian activism.
The moral majority.
Right, the moral majority wielding massive political power, fighting intense battles over family values, school prayer, and moral purity. But that movement is perfectly coexisting with and operating in the exact same society as a hyper-materialistic, sex-drenched, image-obsessed, greed-driven MTV culture.
The ultimate paradox.
Church on Sunday, hustle on Monday, MTV in between. It is a decade of profound moral and spiritual contradiction.
It is the ultimate tension between what a society preaches and what it actually aspires to. The public language was highly moralistic and traditional, but the actual functional aspirations were entirely individualistic and materialistic. When you are told by your leaders to adhere to strict traditional values, but you are also told by the market that greed is good and wealth is the only true virtue, how does a human mind reconcile that cognitive dissonance?
You reconcile it by turning the volume all the way up so you can't hear your own thoughts.
Wow, yes.
It feels like the 1980s is the funniest, loudest guy at the party. You know the type. He's holding court, he's buying everyone drinks, he's telling the best jokes, but he is using sheer volume to outrun his profound vulnerability. He is terrified. Because if he stops flexing, if he stops performing for even 1 second, all of that fear, the fear of nuclear war, the fear of an unknown disease, the fear of economic ruin, the fear that he's a fraud, it all catches up to him.
That is exactly the dynamic.
The 1980s was an entire society outrunning its own shadow.
And the ultimate tragedy is that this constant, relentless cultural pressure to hide struggles under a veneer of success actually exacerbated all of the era's tragedies. The demand for perfection meant that systemic failures and deep personal pains were ignored.
Because it broke the illusion.
Exactly. Admitting vulnerability felt like admitting defeat in a society that only valued visible victory. People suffered in silence because their struggles did not fit the dominant winning narrative.
So we have this intense pressure cooker of a decade. It's building and building, fueled by hyper-consumerism, shadowed by existential dread, connected by these early tech innovations that are isolating us. And then we hit 1989. The Berlin Wall falls.
The turning point.
The decade effectively closes with this massive global sigh of relief. The old Cold War order collapses. So as we look at the legacy, what exactly did the 1980s hand over to the 1990s and ultimately to us sitting here right now?
The 1980s handed off a completely fundamentally transformed world. Geopolitically, the Soviet bloc was fatally weakened, setting up the United States as the uncontested global superpower. Economically, inflation was tamed, but the new architecture of entrenched, structural inequality and the gig economy precursors were firmly in place.
But the real kicker is the tech.
Yes. Perhaps the most profound, lasting legacy lies in the intersection of technology and psychology.
Because this is the decade where the digital future literally moved into the living room. Let's talk about the mechanism of the GUI, the graphical user interface.
Precisely. You have the launch of the IBM PC in 1981, which standardized computing. But the real paradigm shift was the Apple Macintosh in 1984. It popularized the graphical interface. Instead of typing lines of code into a black screen, you used a mouse to click on a picture of a folder on a desktop.
It made it intuitive.
It abstracted the complex machinery into a visual metaphor. Mass-market, user-friendly personal computing was born. We can trace a direct, unbroken lineage from those early interfaces straight to the internet, to the smartphone in your pocket, to the digital world we inhabit every waking moment today. The 1980s built the hardware and the software of our modern physical lives.
But it built the software for our minds, too. That is the real legacy here. The 1980s birthed the influencer mindset decades before the word influencer even existed. The foundational idea that success is entirely image-based, that your identity is a modular media product to be carefully curated, branded, and consumed by an audience.
That's a pure 1980s invention.
I want to speak directly to you listening to this deep dive right now. Think about your daily habits, the way you binge watch your favorite shows to curate your cultural intake, the way you painstakingly build your Spotify playlist to overlay a soundtrack onto your commute, the way you stress over the aesthetics of your personal brand on social media.
None of it is new.
None of that exists without the psychological architecture built in the 1980s. The 80s walked so Instagram could sprint.
It is the crucial bridge between analog community life and modern digital identity culture. The decade handed the 1990s a world where culture moved significantly faster than institutions could regulate it. It handed over a society where politics was permanently staged for the camera and where identity was fully modular, marketable, and solitary.
Yeah.
The technology has advanced remarkably since 1989, but the psychological framework, the crushing pressure to constantly perform our identity, remained, evolved, and amplified.
So let's bring this all together. We set out to unpack the psychological architecture of the 1980s based on this text. And what we found is that it wasn't just a simple, colorful era of nostalgia. It wasn't just some innocent time before cell phones.
Far from it.
It was an incredibly complex, deeply paradoxical decade. It was incredibly loud, but quietly, desperately insecure. It was wildly expressive, but almost entirely performative. It gave us incredible art, music, and the technological foundations of the modern world. But it also masked deep systemic rot and inequality.
It really did.
The 1980s taught the world how to shine brilliantly, but it didn't necessarily teach us how to feel whole.
It was a decade of profound, exhausting contradiction. And understanding those underlying mechanisms is essential. Because when we finally recognize that the 1980s was a carefully constructed performance, we can start to see the performance in our own lives.
That's the key.
We can see how the legacy of that era still dictates our anxieties, our consumption habits, and our relentless daily drive to curate our existence for an invisible audience.
It really is the ultimate aha moment. Once you view the 80s through this lens of armor and performance, you suddenly understand the mechanics of modern digital life. You understand our current obsession with productivity, with image, with making sure everyone knows we are winning, even when we feel like we're losing. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We've peeled back the neon, we've looked past the shoulder pads, and we've examined the invisible armor we are all still wearing today.
And as we conclude our analysis, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. It is a question directly inspired by the profound perspective of the era we've explored today. It is a question that secretly haunted the entire decade of the 1980s, buried just beneath the synthesized bass, and it is one that still echoes loudly in our modern algorithms. Next time you post a carefully curated highlight of your life online, or next time you buy a specific brand to signal to the world who you are, ask yourself this: if I stop performing, do I still matter?